Good morning and welcome. It is 11 o'clock. It is the 18th day of August 2021. I am your grumpy guide to all things gaming, OGGM, and it's the 18th day of RPG A Day 2021. Every day for the month of August, we take a look at these wonderful prompts provided to us by the RPG A Day site on Facebook, and then base our content on what the prompts inspire. And today's prompts are right, duel, honor, and rival. Duel and rival are the words that I'm going to be using, and because this is a topic I was thinking about anyways, and I'm going to sort of hedge it in to those words and talking about the rivalry between magic and technology. So yesterday, as we were going over the latest information from Critical Role and some of the hints for Campaign 3, which should be coming up October-ish, there was some very little speculation at the end of the article, and I sort of talked about it a little, of what the direction of Campaign 3 should be, might be, could be, speculating, based upon Campaign 1 and Campaign 2, and how it might reflect with Mercer moving the timeline history of the world to match by the events of the previous games and by what the player characters have done, which means the Critical Role world is about to enter an industrial revolution. And a lot of people posted on the vlog, okay, what does that mean? And, what does an industrial revolution mean? And it got me thinking, what does an industrial revolution mean to a typical fantasy D&D world? And of course, that makes me think of Ebberon, which is probably the most extreme example of how an industrial revolution hit a typical fantasy D&D world. But Ebberon is very extreme as opposed to what would probably actually happen in the normal progression of an industrial revolution in a world like your typical D&D Middle-earth, Forgotten Realms type world. Again, we can't use the Forgotten Realms as an example because it's all higgledy-piggledy. But let's just say general, normal fantasy game world. Elves, dwarves, small human cities, basically medieval Europe with magic. Magic exists. Magic is something people are aware of. But in general, your average commoner does not have access to magic and will possibly go through their entire lives without ever seeing anything actually magical or seeing anything truly heroic. Magic and superpowers are limited to the player characters and important NPCs. That is the typical fantasy game. Magic exists, gods exist, clerics exist, all that hodgepodge you find in the player's handbook exists, but it's generally limited to a small percent of the population. Then an industrial revolution hits. Now, first off, before we go any further, and the rivalry between technology and magic, we have to understand that even with, wish-level, world-altering magic that might be available, an industrial revolution does not happen overnight. It is a slow but inevitable progress of a world. And there are certain things that key the beginning of an industrial revolution, usually involving money, power, or sex. Because those are pretty much the three things that motivate everything. Now, an industrial revolution is usually defined by a couple things. The main ones, of course, being the introduction of a middle class. Now, in the normal world, as we were coming out of the Dark Ages and entering into the Age of Reason in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we basically had two classes. You had the nobles and basically the rich, and you had the commoners who were very poor. The Industrial Revolution introduces the idea of a middle class, people who have money but are not rich. It also introduces the concept of modernized production of resources. Before an industrial revolution, there might be one guy within 100 miles who is a master level blacksmith or jeweler or paper maker or whatever. And that guy is able to make maybe 1-2 things a month. If he's like making a sword, suit of armor, things. But then there's not that much need for what he's making. And what he makes requires a lot of time, a lot of energy, and it's limited to what he can produce in his time. And if he has the ability to pass on his skill set to someone else, otherwise what he knows how to do is lost when that person dies. The Industrial Revolution introduces the idea of factories, introduces the idea of mass production, introduces the idea that not just one person can now do this, but dozens of people can do this because they have access to technology that allows them to. The mass production of what was previously a product that you could only see maybe once or twice a year completely changes the world. The idea of mass production, the idea of trade, the idea of an introduction of a middle class, and more importantly, and how that would affect the fantasy world, the rivalry is magic versus technology. Magic is limited to certain individuals. It takes a long time, it takes a lot of energy and practice to learn to be a wizard, cleric, whatever. Only a small elite have access to those powers. Technology pretty much allows everybody to have access to those powers. That's the difference between, say, magic and a gun, or an expert marksman and a gun. It might take years for an expert archer to learn how to use his bow to the precise level that he would need to be a expert level bowman fighter, 10th level guy with a bow. Any idiot can pick up a gun and within a few minutes figure out how to pull the trigger and has a 60-40 chance of that bullet actually hitting something. And guns can be mass produced. Magic is very limited. Technology allows anybody to have access to things that were only accessible to a certain elite. So again, Industrial Revolution means the introduction of a middle class, the introduction of common people being able to do things that in the past were only limited to a select few. Now, in a fantasy game, there's two possibilities for an Industrial Revolution, but both basically mean the same thing. You could have a magical Industrial Revolution, i.e. Ebberon, where magic is used to progress the technology further, via trade, via mass production, via things being available to people, things that were normally taken for granted and you maybe only saw once or twice in your life, now you can see on a regular basis. And that can be food, that can be healthcare, that can be construction, all the things that somebody in a small fantasy village has to work an entire life to get and build and create, suddenly becomes readily available as an Industrial Revolution begins. Also trade, an awareness of a world beyond your walls. Suddenly we're trading with other countries. Suddenly we're trading around the world. Suddenly things from around the world become available to us as shipbuilding and commerce progresses, eventually to modernized shipbuilding, modernized means of transportation, eventually possibly introducing something similar to a railroad. Certain things key the idea of an Industrial Revolution. An Industrial Revolution does not happen overnight, but it will happen, and you will slowly see things that were once a limited commodity becoming more and more available to your common man, and that therefore allowing common men to lift themselves out of the drudgery of spending their entire life to master one task. So to the now we have leisure time. I can work Monday through Friday and take Saturday and Sunday off because I have access to these machines now, mills, pressing things, stuff like that, that allows me to take time off. It allows me to better myself. It allows me to lift myself and my family out of the drudgery to a middle class. And the middle class will soon outgrow the elite. More and more people, more and more space, more and more needs, more and more production. Production equals needs equals production. Jobs, people who are once, drudgery farmers are now middle class and upper middle class, while the nobles and the very, very rich, whose power will continue to grow, will become much smaller. And soon there will be more common people than there are rich people, because there will be a need for people with these skills And there's no need for a guy whose job is just, I'm rich. A magical industrial revolution means magic has suddenly become readily available to your common man, and your common man can use that magic to increase production, increase use of resources, increase creativity, do something in days that used to take years. But again, basically magic now is in the hands of everybody, when before it was only in a elite few. Therefore, what do I need a wizard for? I've got things that can do the same thing a wizard could do. What do I need a cleric for? I've got medicine and band-aids. Does the same thing that a cleric does. The elite will find themselves slowly being replaced by mass production. People will begin to realize, I don't need you anymore. There's nothing you can do that now I don't have access to via technology, via production, via mass transit, via the advancements of technology. And the same thing would happen if there was a technological revolution, industrial revolution in this magic world. Suddenly, technology would surpass magic. Suddenly, something that only an elite few had access to will now slowly become available to everybody. Eventually, as production continues, money continues to flow, your average man can walk into a store and buy something that in the past was very, very limited or only accessible to adventurers or via magic, which will make the idea of adventuring parties much more obsolete. I don't need 3 or 4 specialists to go out and do things, because those threats can now be more rapidly dealt with, more effectively dealt with via the progression of technology. And the final thing that an industrial revolution means is, of course, the negative. We will now have things like smog and factories running 24 hours. You will have an incredible need for resources to power these industrial technology. You will see huge swaths of natural resources begin to dwindle. Forests will get cut down, mountains will be mined, farmlands will be taken over to make space for factories. The poor will become poorer and more plentiful. The rich will become richer and less plentiful, and the middle class will begin to grow, leaving the fantasy village behind and coming to the city, because that's where the jobs are, that's where the progress is, and that's where the ability to make more money, to gather more power, or to have more sex is going to be. Destroying forests are, of course, going to piss off all the forest dwellers. Destroying mountains will piss off all the magical mountain creatures, and all the creatures that generally rely on magic will find themselves beginning to dwindle and get weaker as technology, or magic technology, begins to suppress what was the natural order of the world, which will eventually lead to conflict, as we know, indigenous species fighting against the more technologically advanced explorers, colonizers, conquerors, which 9 out of 10 times the more advanced explorers, colonizers, conquerors will obliterate or integrate those societies into them. Eventually, steel, guns, disease, and trade are all the things that shape a evolution of a future. That rivalry, the duel between magic and technology, in a one-on-one battle between magic and technology, magic always wins. But in a mass idea of magic is limited to a select few versus anybody and their dog can have access to the technology, only 1 or 2 individuals are skilled enough to cast that fireball, anybody and their dog can go get gunpowder and light a match. Eventually, when it comes to mass technology versus mass magical creatures, humans with machines versus elves with bows, the humans with the machines are going to win. You will see a dwindling of magical, fantastic resources as the Industrial Revolution takes its place with technological marvels. So the rivalry between magic and technology, the duel of the two worlds, if the Critical Role campaign number 3 does introduce a industrial revolution, whether it be a slow industrial revolution or just hand wave 100 years has passed since campaign number 2, and we are now deep into the Industrial Revolution on the Critical Role world, it means vast changes, vast duels of ideals, vast duels of philosophy, vast duels of power, vast duels of money, vast duels of resources, vast duels for reproduction rights, people fleeing the countryside to go to the city, the countryside being destroyed for the need for fuel, elite, limited resources being replaced by vast, improved mass technological resources. Wizards and adventurers finding themselves no longer needed. And the possible conflict between the remaining magical races and the advancing inevitableness of industrialism. So there we go. The word is duel. As we philosophize and theorycraft what would happen if an industrial revolution hit a magic world. Yeah. Okay. If you appreciate this content and want to see more, let me know. If you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. Help me hit 1,000 subs. If you want to take part in RPG a day, it's still not too late. Just head on over to Facebook and check out the link. I'm your grumpy guide to all things gaming, the hairbringer of the Industrial Revolution to your magical world. Click, click, bang, bang. I'll talk to you later.